Chapter 22 of Brood of the Witch Queen by Sax Rohmer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 22 Myra. Myra Duquesne came under an arch of roses to the wooden seat where Robert Cairn awaited her. In her plain white linen frock, with the sun in her hair, and her eyes looking unnaturally large, owing to the pallor of her beautiful face, she seemed to the man who rose to greet her an ethereal creature, but lightly linked to the flesh and blood world. An impulse which had possessed him often enough before, but which hitherto he had suppressed, suddenly possessed him anew, set his heart beating, and filled his veins with fire. As a soft blush spread over the girl's pale cheeks, and with a sort of timidity, she held out her hand. He leapt to his feet, threw his arms around her and kissed her eyes, her hair, her lips. There was a moment of frightened hesitancy, and then she had resigned herself to this sort of savage tenderness which was better in its very brutality than any caress she had ever known, which thrilled her with a glorious joy such as, she realized now, she had dreamt of and lacked and wanted, which was a harbourage to which she came, blushing, confused, but glad, conquered, and happy in the thrall of that exquisite slavery. "Myra," he whispered, "Myra! Have I frightened you? Will you forgive me?" She nodded her head quickly and nestled upon his shoulder. "I could wait no longer," he murmured in her ear. "Words seemed unnecessary. I just wanted you. You are everything in the world, and," he concluded simply, "I took you." She whispered his name very softly. What a serenity there is in such a moment, what a glow of secure happiness, of immunity from the pains and sorrows of the world. Robert Cairn, his arms about this girl who, from his early boyhood, had been his ideal of womanhood, of love, and of all that love meant, forgot those things which had shaken his life and brought him to the threshold of death, forgot those evidences of illness which marred the once glorious beauty of the girl, forgot the black menace of the future, forgot the wizard enemy whose hand was stretched over that house and that garden, and was merely happy. But this paroxysm of gladness, which Eliphas Levi, last of the adepts, has so marvellously analysed in one of his works, is of short duration, as are all joys. It is needless to recount here the broken sentences, punctuated with those first kisses which sweeten the memory of old age, that now passed for conversation, and which lovers have believed to be conversation since the world began. As dusk creeps over a glorious landscape, so the shadow of Antony Ferrara crept over the happiness of these two. Gradually that shadow fell between them and the sun, the grim thing which loomed big in the lives of them both, refused any longer to be ignored. Robert Cairn, his arm about the girl's waist, broached the hated subject. "When did you last see Ferrara?" Myra looked up suddenly. "Over a week, nearly a fortnight ago." "Ah!" Cairn noted that the girl spoke of Ferrara with an odd sort of restraint for which he was at a loss to account. Myra had always regarded her guardian's adopted son in the light of a brother, therefore her present attitude was all the more singular. "You did not expect him to return to England so soon?" he asked. "I had no idea that he was in England," said Myra, "until he walked in here one day. I was glad to see him then." "And should you not be glad to see him now?" inquired Cairn eagerly. Myra, her head lowered, deliberately pressed out a crease in her white skirt. "One day last week," she replied slowly, "he came here and acted strangely." "In what way?" jerked Cairn. "He pointed out to me that actually he and I, were in no way related." "Well?" "You know how I have always liked Antony. I have always thought of him as my brother." Again she hesitated, and a troubled expression crept over her pale face. Cairn raised his arm and clasped it about her shoulders. "Tell me about it," he whispered reassuringly. "Well," continued Myra in evident confusion, "his behaviour became embarrassing, and suddenly he asked me if I could ever love him, not as a brother, but—" "I understand," said Cairn grimly. "And you replied?" "For some time I could not reply at all. I was so surprised and so horrified. I cannot explain how I felt about it, but it seemed horrible. It seemed horrible." "But of course you told him?" "I told him that I could never be fond of him in any different way, that I could never think of it. And although I endeavoured to avoid hurting his feelings, he took it very badly. He said, in such a queer choking voice, that he was going away." "Away? From England?" "Yes, and he made a strange request." "What was it?" "In the circumstances, you see, I felt sorry for him. I did not like to refuse him. It was only a trifling thing. He asked for a lock of my hair." "A lock of your hair? And you—" "I told you that I did not like to refuse, and I let him snip off a tiny piece with a pair of pocket scissors which he had. Are you angry?" "Of course not. You were almost brought up together. You—" "Then," she paused, "he seemed to change. Suddenly I found myself afraid, dreadfully afraid." "Of Ferrara?" "Not of Antony exactly. But what is the good of my trying to explain? A most awful dread seized me. His face was no longer the face that I have always known. Something—" Her voice trembled, and she seemed disposed to leave the sentence unfinished. Then, "Something evil, sinister, had come into it." "And since then?" said Cairn. "You have not seen him?" "He has not been here since then. No." Cairn, his hands resting upon the girl's shoulders, leant back in the seat and looked into her troubled eyes with a kind of sad scrutiny. "You have not been fretting about him?" Myra shook her head. "Yet you look as though something were troubling you. This house," he indicated the low lying garden with a certain irritation, "is not healthily situated. This place lies in a valley. Look at the rank grass, and there are mosquitoes everywhere. You do not look well, Myra." The girl smiled a little wistful smile. "But I was so tired of Scotland," she said. "You do not know how I looked forward to London again. I must admit, though, that I was in better health there. I was quite ashamed of my dairymaid appearance." "You have nothing to amuse you here," said Cairn tenderly. "No company, for Mr. Saunderson only lives for his orchids." "They are very fascinating," said Myra dreamily. "I, too, have felt their glamour. I am the only member of the household whom he allows amongst his orchids." "Perhaps you spend too much time there," interrupted Cairn. "That superheated, artificial atmosphere—" Myra shook her head playfully, patting his arm. "There is nothing in the world the matter with me," she said almost in her old bright manner, "now that you are back." "I do not approve of orchids," jerked Cairn doggedly. "They are parodies of what a flower should be. Place an odontoglossum beside a rose, and what a distorted, unholy thing it looks." "Unholy?" laughed Myra. "Unholy, yes. They are products of feverish swamps and deathly jungles. I hate orchids. The atmosphere of an orchid house cannot possibly be clean and healthy. One might as well spend one's time in a bacteriological laboratory." Myra shook her head with affected seriousness. "You must not let Mr. Saunderson hear you," she said. "His orchids are his children. Their very mystery enthralls him, and really it is most fascinating. To look at one of those shapeless bulbs, and to speculate upon what kind of bloom it will produce, is almost as thrilling as reading a sensational novel. He has one growing now. It will bloom some time this week, about which he is frantically excited." "Where did he get it?" asked Cairn without interest. "He bought it from a man who had almost certainly stolen it. There were 6 bulbs in the parcel. Only 2 have lived, and one of these is much more advanced than the other. It is so high." She held out her hand, indicating a height of some 3 feet from the ground. "It has not flowered yet?" "No, but the buds, huge, smooth, egg shaped things, seem on the point of bursting at any moment. We call it the mystery, and it is my special care. Mr. Saunderson has shown me how to attend to its simple needs, and if it proves to be a new species, which is almost certain, he is going to exhibit it and name it after me. Shall you be proud of having an orchid named after—" "After my wife," Cairn concluded, seizing her hands. "I could never be more proud of you than I am already." End of Chapter 22. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. Chapter 23 of Brood of the Witch Queen by Sax Rohmer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 23. The Face in the Orchid House. Dr. Cairn walked to the window, with its old fashioned leaded panes. A lamp stood by the bedside, and he had tilted the shade so that it shone upon the pale face of the patient, Myra Duquesne. 2 days had wrought a dreadful change in her. She lay with closed eyes and sunken face, upon which ominous shadows played. Her respiration was imperceptible. The reputation of Dr. Bruce Cairn was a well-deserved one, but this case puzzled him. He knew that Myra Duquesne was dying before his eyes. He could still see the agonized face of his son Robert, who at that moment was waiting, filled with intolerable suspense, downstairs in Mr. Saunderson's study. But withal he was helpless. He looked out from the rose-entwined casement across the shrubbery to where the moonlight glittered among the trees. Those were the orchid houses, and with his back to the bed Dr. Cairn stood for long, thoughtfully watching the distant gleams of reflected light. Craig Fenton and Sir Elwyn Groves, with whom he had been consulting, were but just gone. The nature of Myra Duquesne's illness had utterly puzzled them, and they had left mystified. Downstairs, Robert Cairn was pacing the study, wondering if his reason would survive with this final blow which threatened. He knew, and his father knew, that a sinister something underlay this strange illness, an illness which had commenced on the day that Antony Ferrara had last visited the house. The evening was insufferably hot. Not a breeze stirred in the leaves, and despite open windows the air of the room was heavy and lifeless. A faint perfume, having a sort of sweetness, but which yet was unutterably revolting, made itself perceptible to the nostrils. Apparently it had pervaded the house by slow degrees. The occupants were so used to it that they did not notice it at all. Dr. Cairn had busied himself that evening in the sick room, burning some pungent preparation, to the amazement of the nurse and of the consultants. Now the biting fumes of his pastilles had all been wafted out of the window, and the faint, sweet smell was as noticeable as ever. Not a sound broke the silence of the house, and when the nurse quietly opened the door and entered, Dr. Cairn was still standing staring thoughtfully out of the window in the direction of the orchid houses. He turned, and walking back to the bedside, bent over the patient. Her face was like a white mask. She was quite unconscious, and so far as he could see, showed no change for either better or worse. But her pulse was slightly more feeble, and the doctor suppressed a groan of despair, for this mysterious progressive weakness could only have one end. All his experience told him that unless something could be done, and every expedient thus far attempted had proved futile, Myra Duquesne would die about dawn. He turned on his heel and strode from the room, whispering a few words of instruction to the nurse. Descending the stairs, he passed the closed study door, not daring to think of his son who waited within, and entered the dining room. A single lamp burnt there, and the gaunt figure of Mr. Saunderson was outlined dimly where he sat in the window seat. Crombie, the gardener, stood by the table. "Now, Crombie," said Dr. Cairn quietly, closing the door behind him, "what is this story about the orchid houses, and why did you not mention it before?" The man stared persistently into the shadows of the room, avoiding Dr. Cairn's glance. "Since he has had the courage to own up," interrupted Mr. Saunderson, "I have overlooked the matter, but he was afraid to speak before because he had no business to be in the orchid houses." His voice grew suddenly fierce. "He knows it well enough." "I know, sir, that you don't want me to interfere with the orchids," replied the man, "but I only ventured in because I thought I saw a light moving there." "Rubbish!" snapped Mr. Saunderson. "Pardon me, Saunderson," said Dr. Cairn, "but a matter of more importance than the welfare of all the orchids in the world is under consideration now." Saunderson coughed drily. "You are right, Cairn," he said. "I shouldn't have lost my temper for such a trifle at a time like this. Tell your own tale, Crombie. I won't interrupt." "It was last night, then," continued the man. "I was standing at the door of my cottage smoking a pipe before turning in, when I saw a faint light moving over by the orchid houses." "Reflection of the moon," muttered Saunderson. "I am sorry. Go on, Crombie." "I knew that some of the orchids were very valuable, and I thought there would not be time to call you.
Also, I did not want to worry you, knowing that you had worry enough already. So I knocked out my pipe and put it in my pocket and went through the shrubbery. I saw the light again. It seemed to be moving from the first house into the second. I couldn't see what it was."
"Was it like a candle or a pocket lamp?" jerked Dr. Cairn.
"Nothing like that, sir. A softer light, more like a glowworm, but much brighter. I went around and tried the door, and it was locked. Then I remembered the door at the other end, and I cut round by the path between the houses and the wall, so that I had no chance to see the light again until I got to the other door. I found this unlocked. There was a close kind of smell in there, sir, and the air was very hot."
"Naturally it was hot," interrupted Saunderson.
"I mean much hotter than it should have been. It was like an oven, and the smell was stifling."
"What smell?" asked Dr. Cairn. "Can you describe it?"
"Excuse me, sir, but I seem to notice it here in this room to night, and I think I noticed it about the place before. Never so strong as in the orchid houses."
"Go on," said Dr. Cairn.
"I went through the first house and saw nothing. The shadow of the wall prevented the moonlight from shining in there. But just as I was about to enter the middle house, I thought I saw a face."
"What do you mean, you thought you saw?" snapped Mr. Saunderson.
"I mean, sir, that it was so horrible and so strange that I could not believe it was real, which was one of the reasons why I did not speak before. It reminded me of the face of a gentleman I have seen here, Mr. Ferrara."
Dr. Cairn stifled an exclamation.
"But in other ways it was quite unlike the gentleman. In some ways it was more like the face of a woman, a very bad woman. It had a sort of bluish light on it, but where it could have come from I don't know. It seemed to be smiling, and two bright eyes looked straight out at me."
Crombie stopped, raising his hand to his head confusedly.
"I could see nothing but just his face, low down, as if the person it belonged to was crouching on the floor, and there was a tall plant of some kind just beside it."
"Well," said Dr. Cairn, "go on. What did you do?"
"I turned to run," confessed the man. "If you had seen that horrible face, you would understand how frightened I was. Then, when I got to the door, I looked back."
"I hope you had closed the door behind you," snapped Saunderson. Never mind that," interrupted Dr. Cairn.
"I had closed the door behind me, yes, sir, but just as I was going to open it again, I took a quick glance back, and the face had gone. I came out, and I was walking over the lawn, wondering whether I should tell you, when it occurred to me that I hadn't noticed whether the key had been left in or not."
"Did you go back to see?" asked Dr. Cairn.
"I didn't want to," admitted Crombie, "but I did, and—"
"Well?"
"The door was locked, sir."
"So you concluded that your imagination had been playing you tricks," said Saunderson grimly. "In my opinion, you were right." Dr. Cairn dropped into an armchair. "All right, Crombie, that will do." Crombie, with a mumbled "Good night, gentlemen," turned and left the room. "Why are you worrying about this matter?" inquired Saunderson, when the door had closed, "at a time like the present?" "Never mind," replied Dr. Cairn wearily. "I must return to Half Moon Street now, but I shall be back within an hour." With no other word to Saunderson, he stood up and walked out to the hall. He rapped at the study door, and it was instantly opened by Robert Cairn. No spoken word was necessary. The burning question could be read in his two bright eyes. Dr. Cairn laid his hand upon his son's shoulder. "I won't excite false hopes, Robbs," he said huskily. "I'm going back to the house, and I want you to come with me." Robert Cairn turned his head aside, groaning aloud, but his father grasped him by the arm, and together they left the House of Shadows, entered the car which waited at the gate, and without exchanging a word en route, came to Half Moon Street. End of chapter 23. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. Chapter 24 of Brood of the Witch Queen by Sax Rohmer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 24 Flowering of the Lotus. Dr. Cairn led the way into the library, switching on the reading lamp upon the large table. His son stood just within the doorway, his arms folded and his chin upon his breast. The doctor sat down at the table, watching the other. Suddenly Robert spoke.
"Is it possible, sir, is it possible," his voice was barely audible, "that her illness can in any way be due to the orchids?"
Dr. Cairn frowned thoughtfully. "What do you mean, exactly?" he asked.
"Orchids are mysterious things. They come from places where there are strange and dreadful diseases. Is it not possible that they may convey—"
"Some sort of contagion," concluded Dr. Cairn. "It is a point that I have seen raised, certainly, but nothing of the sort has ever been established. I have heard something to night, though, which—"
"What have you heard, sir?" asked his son eagerly, stepping forward to the table.
"Never mind at the moment, Rob. Let me think." He rested his elbow upon the table and his chin in his hand. His professional instincts had told him that unless something could be done, something which the highest medical skill in London had thus far been unable to devise, Myra Duquesne had but 4 hours to live. Somewhere in his mind a memory lurked, evasive, taunting him. This wild suggestion of his son's that the girl's illness might be due in some way to her contact with the orchids was in part responsible for this confused memory, but it seemed to be associated, too, with the story of Crombie the gardener, and with Antony Ferrara. He felt that somewhere in the darkness surrounding him there was a speck of light, if he could but turn in the right direction to see it. So, whilst Robert Cairn walked restlessly about the big room, the doctor sat with his chin resting in the palm of his hand, seeking to concentrate his mind upon that vague memory which defied him, whilst the hand of the library clock crept from 12 towards 1. Whilst he knew that the faint life in Myra Duquesne was slowly ebbing away in response to some mysterious condition, utterly outside his experience. Distant clocks chimed. 1. 3 hours only. Robert Cairn began to beat his fist into the palm of his left hand convulsively. Yet his father did not stir, but sat there, a black shadowed wrinkle between his brows. "By God!" The doctor sprang to his feet, and with feverish haste began to fumble amongst a bunch of keys.
"What is it, sir? What is it?"
The doctor unlocked the drawer of the big table and drew out a thick manuscript written in small and exquisitely neat characters. He placed it under the lamp and rapidly began to turn the pages. "It is hope, Rob," he said with quiet self-possession. Robert Cairn came round the table and leant over his father's shoulder.
"Sir Michael Ferrara's writing."
"His unpublished book, Rob. We were to have completed it together, but death claimed him, and in view of the contents, I, perhaps superstitiously, decided to suppress it." "Ah!" He placed the point of his finger upon a carefully drawn sketch designed to illustrate the text. It was evidently a careful copy from the ancient Egyptian. It represented a row of priestesses, each having her hair plaited in a thick queue, standing before a priest armed with a pair of scissors. In the centre of the drawing was an altar, upon which stood vases of flowers, and upon the right ranked a row of mummies, corresponding in number with the priestesses upon the left. "By God!" repeated Dr. Cairn. "We were both wrong. We were both wrong."
"What do you mean, sir? For heaven's sake, what do you mean?"
"This drawing," replied Dr. Cairn, "was copied from the wall of a certain tomb, now reclosed. Since we knew that the tomb was that of one of the greatest wizards who ever lived in Egypt, we knew also that the inscription had some magical significance. We knew that the flowers represented here were a species of the extinct sacred lotus. All our researches did not avail us to discover for what purpose or by what means these flowers were cultivated. Nor could we determine the meaning of the cutting off," he ran his fingers over the sketch, "of the priestess's hair by the high priest of the goddess."
"What goddess, sir?"
"A goddess, Rob, of which Egyptology knows nothing. A mystical religion, the existence of which has been vaguely suspected by a living French savant. But this is no time." Dr. Cairn closed the manuscript, replaced it, and relocked the drawer. He glanced at the clock. "1:15," he said. "Come, Rob." Without hesitation his son followed him from the house. The car was waiting, and shortly they were speeding through the deserted streets back to the house where death in a strange guise was beckoning to Myra Duquesne. As the car started, "Do you know," asked Dr. Cairn, "if Saunderson has bought any orchids? Quite recently, I mean?"
"Yes," replied his son dully. "He bought a small parcel only a fortnight ago."
"A fortnight!" cried Dr. Cairn excitedly. "You are sure of that? You mean that the purchase was made since Ferrara?"
"Ceased to visit the house? Yes. Why, it must have been the very day after."
Dr. Cairn clearly was labouring under tremendous excitement. "Where did he buy these orchids?" he asked evenly.
"From someone who came to the house, someone he had never dealt with before."
The doctor, his hands resting upon his knees, was rapidly drumming with his fingers. "And did he cultivate them?"
"Two only proved successful. One is on the point of blooming, if it is not blooming already. He calls it the Mystery."
At that the doctor's excitement overcame him. Suddenly leaning out of the window, he shouted to the chauffeur, "Quicker, quicker! Never mind risks. Keep on top speed."
"What is it, sir?" cried his son. "Heavens, what is it?"
"Did you say that it might have bloomed, Rob?"
"Myra," Robert Cairn swallowed noisily, "told me 3 days ago that it was expected to bloom before the end of the week."
"What is it like?"
"A thing 4 feet high, with huge egg-shaped bulbs."
"Merciful God, grant that we are in time," whispered Dr. Cairn. "I could believe once more in the justice of Heaven if the great knowledge of Sir Michael Ferrara should prove to be the weapon to destroy the fiend whom we raised, he and I. May we be forgiven." Robert Cairn's excitement was dreadful.
"Can you tell me nothing?" he cried. "What do you hope? What do you fear?"
"Don't ask me, Rob," replied his father. "You will know within 5 minutes." The car indeed was leaping along the dark suburban roads at a speed little below that of an express train. Corners the chauffeur negotiated in racing fashion, so that at times 2 wheels thrashed the empty air, and once or twice the big car swung round as upon a pivot, only to recover again in response to the skilled tactics of the driver. They roared down the sloping narrow lane to the gate of Mr. Saunderson's house with a noise like the coming of a great storm, and were nearly hurled from their seats when the brakes were applied and the car brought to a standstill. Dr. Cairn leapt out, pushed open the gate, and ran up to the house, his son closely following. There was a light in the hall, and Miss Saunderson, who had expected them, and had heard their stormy approach, already held the door open. In the hall "Wait here one moment," said Dr. Cairn. Ignoring Saunderson, who had come out from the library, he ran upstairs. A minute later, his face very pale, he came running down again. "She is worse," began Saunderson, "but—" "Give me the key of the orchid house," said Dr. Cairn tersely. "Orchid house? Don't hesitate. Don't waste a second. Give me the key." Saunderson's expression showed that he thought Dr. Cairn to be mad, but nevertheless he plunged his hand into his pocket and pulled out a key ring. Dr. Cairn snatched it in a flash. "Which key?" he snapped.
"The Chubb, but—"
"Follow me, Rob." Down the hall he raced, his son beside him, and Mr. Saunderson following more slowly. Out into the garden he went, and over the lawn towards the shrubbery. The orchid houses lay in dense shadow, but the doctor almost threw himself against the door. "Strike a match," he panted. Then, "Never mind, I have it." The door flew open with a bang. A sickly perfume swept out to them. "Matches! Matches, Rob! This way!" They went stumbling in. Robert Cairn took out a box of matches and struck one. His father was further along, in the centre of the building. "Your knife, boy! Quick! Quick!" As the dim light crept along the aisle between the orchids, Robert Cairn saw his father's horror-stricken face, and saw a vivid green plant growing in a sort of tub, before which the doctor stood. 4 huge, smooth, egg-shaped bulbs grew upon the leafless stems. 2 of them were on the point of opening, and one already showed a delicious rosy flush about its apex. Dr. Cairn grasped the knife which Robert tremblingly offered him. The match went out. There was a sound of hacking, a soft swishing, and a dull thud upon the tiled floor. As another match fluttered into brief life, the mysterious orchid, severed just above the soil, fell from the tub. Dr. Cairn stamped the swelling buds under his feet. A profusion of colourless sap was pouring out on the floor. Above the intoxicating odour of the place, a smell like that of blood made itself perceptible. The second match went out. "Another!" Dr. Cairn's voice rose barely above a whisper. With fingers quivering, Robert Cairn managed to light a third match. His father, from a second tub, tore out a smaller plant and ground its soft tentacles beneath his feet. The place smelt like an operating theatre. The doctor swayed dizzily as the third match became extinguished, clutching at his son for support. "Her life was in it, boy," he whispered. "She would have died in the hour that it bloomed. The priestesses were consecrated to this. Let me get into the air." Mr. Saunderson, silent with amazement, met them. "Don't speak," said Dr. Cairn to him. "Look at the dead stems of your mystery. You will find a thread of bright hair in the heart of each." Dr. Cairn opened the door of the sick room and beckoned to his son, who, haggard, trembling, waited upon the landing. "Come in, boy," he said softly, "and thank God." Robert Cairn, on tiptoe, entered. Myra Duquesne, pathetically pale, but with that dreadful, ominous shadow gone from her face, turned her wistful eyes towards the door, and their wistfulness became gladness.
"Rob," she sighed, and stretched out her arms.
Chapter 24. By Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. Chapter 25 of Brood of the Witch Queen by Sax Rohmer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 25. Cairn meets Ferrara. Not the least of the trials which Robert Cairn experienced during the time that he and his father were warring with their supernaturally equipped opponent was that of preserving silence upon this matter, which loomed so large in his mind, and which already had changed the course of his life. Sometimes he met men who knew Ferrara, but who knew him only as a man about town of somewhat evil reputation. Yet even to these he dared not confide what he knew of the true Ferrara. Undoubtedly they would have deemed him mad had he spoken of the knowledge and of the deeds of this uncanny, this fiendish being. How would they have listened to him had he sought to tell them of the den of spiders in Port Said, of the bats of Méydûm, of the secret incense and of how it was made, of the numberless murders and atrocities wrought by means not human which stood to the account of this adopted son of the late Sir Michael Ferrara? So, excepting his father, he had no confidant. For above all it was necessary to keep the truth from Myra Duquesne, from Myra around whom his world circled, but who yet thought of the dreadful being who wielded the sorcery of forgotten ages as a brother. Whilst Myra lay ill, not yet recovered from the ghastly attack made upon her life by the man whom she trusted, whilst having painful evidence of his presence in London, Dr. Cairn and himself vainly sought for Antony Ferrara. Whilst any night might bring some unholy visitant to his rooms, obedient to the will of this modern wizard, whilst these fears, anxieties, doubts and surmises danced impish through his brain, it was all but impossible to pursue with success his vocation of journalism. Yet, for many reasons, it was necessary that he should do so, and so he was employed upon a series of articles which were the outcome of his recent visit to Egypt, his editor having given him that work as being less exacting than that which properly falls to the lot of the Fleet Street copy hunter. He left his rooms about 3 o'clock in the afternoon in order to seek, in the British Museum library, a reference which he lacked; and he derived some little satisfaction from the fact that, at his present work, he was not called upon to endue the armour of respectability. Pipe in mouth, he made his way across the Strand towards Bloomsbury. As he walked up the steps, crossed the hallway, and passed in beneath the dome of the reading room, he wondered if, amid these mountains of erudition surrounding him, there was any wisdom so strange and so awful as that of Antony Ferrara. He soon found the information for which he was looking, and having copied it into his notebook, he left the reading room. Then, as he was recrossing the hall near the foot of the principal staircase, he paused. He found himself possessed by a sudden desire to visit the Egyptian rooms upstairs. He had several times inspected the exhibits in those apartments, but never since his return from the land to whose ancient civilization they bore witness. Cairn was not pressed for time in these days, therefore he turned and passed slowly up the stairs. There were but few visitors to the Grove of Mummies that afternoon. When he entered the first room he found a small group of tourists passing idly from case to case. But on entering the second he saw that he had the apartment to himself. He remembered that his father had mentioned on one occasion that there was a ring in this room which had belonged to the Witch Queen. Robert Cairn wondered in which of the cases it was exhibited, and by what means he should be enabled to recognise it. Bending over a case containing scarabs and other amulets, many set in rings, he began to read the inscriptions upon the little tickets placed beneath some of them, but none answered to the description, neither the ticketed nor the unticketed. A second case he examined with like results, but on passing to a third, in an angle near the door, his gaze immediately lighted upon a gold ring set with a strange green stone engraved in a peculiar way. It bore no ticket, yet as Robert Cairn eagerly bent over it, he knew beyond the possibility of doubt that this was the ring of the Witch Queen. Where had he seen it, or its duplicate? With his eyes fixed upon the gleaming stone, he sought to remember. That he had seen this ring before, or one exactly like it, he knew, but strangely enough he was unable to determine where and upon what occasion. So, his hands resting upon the case, he leant, peering down at the singular gem. And as he stood thus, frowning in the effort of recollection, a dull white hand, having long tapered fingers, glided across the glass until it rested directly beneath his eyes. Upon one of the slim fingers was an exact replica of the ring in the case. Robert Cairn leapt back with a stifled exclamation. Antony Ferrara stood before him. "The museum ring is a copy, dear Cairn," came the huskily musical, hateful voice. "The one upon my finger is the real one." Cairn realised in his own person the literal meaning of the overworked phrase, frozen with amazement. Before him stood the most dangerous man in Europe, a man who had done murder and worse, a man only in name, a demon in nature. His long black eyes half closed, his perfectly chiselled ivory face expressionless, and his blood red lips parted in a mirthless smile. Antony Ferrara watched Cairn, whom he had sought to murder by means of hellish art. Despite the heat of the day, he wore a heavy overcoat lined with white fox fur. In his right hand, for his left still rested upon the case, he held a soft hat. With an easy nonchalance he stood regarding the man who had sworn to kill him, and the latter made no move, uttered no word. Stark amazement held him inert. "I knew that you were in the museum, Cairn," Ferrara continued, still having his basilisk eyes fixed upon the other from beneath the drooping lids, "and I called to you to join me here." Still Cairn did not move, did not speak. "You have acted very harshly towards me in the past, dear Cairn, but because my philosophy consists in an admirable blending of that practised in Sybaris with that advocated by the excellent Zeno, because whilst I am prepared to make my home in a Diogenes tub, I, nevertheless, can enjoy the fragrance of a rose, the flavour of a peach." The husky voice seemed to be hypnotising Cairn. It was a siren's voice, thralling him. "Because," continued Ferrara evenly, "in common with all humanity, I am compound of man and woman, I can resent the enmity which drives me from shore to shore, but being myself a connoisseur of the red lips and laughing eyes of maidenhood, I am thinking, more particularly, of Myra. I can forgive you, dear Cairn." Then Cairn recovered himself. "You white-faced cur!" he snared through clenched teeth. His knuckles whitened as he stepped around the case. "You dare to stand there mocking me!" Ferrara again placed the case between himself and his enemy. "Pause, my dear Cairn," he said, without emotion. "What would you do? Be discreet, dear Cairn. Reflect that I have only to call an attendant in order to have you pitched ignominiously into the street." "Before God, I will throttle the life from you," said Cairn, in a voice savagely hoarse. He sprang again towards Ferrara. Again the latter dodged around the case with an agility which defied the heavier man. "Your temperament is so painfully Celtic, Cairn," he protested mockingly. "I perceive quite clearly that you will not discuss this matter judicially. Must I then call for the attendant?" Cairn clenched his fists convulsively. through all the tumult of his rage, the fact had penetrated that he was helpless. He could not attack Ferrara in that place. He could not detain him against his will. For Ferrara had only to claim official protection to bring about the complete discomfiture of his assailant. Across the case containing the duplicate ring, he glared at this incarnate fiend, whom the law, which he had secretly outraged, now served to protect. Ferrara spoke again in his huskily musical voice. "I regret that you will not be reasonable, Cairn. There is so much that I should like to say to you. There are so many things of interest which I could tell you. Do you know, in some respects I am particularly gifted, Cairn. At times I can recollect quite distinctly particulars of former incarnations. Do you see that priestess lying there just through the doorway? I can quite distinctly remember having met her when she was a girl. She was beautiful, Cairn. And I can even recall how one night beside the Nile But I see that you are growing impatient. If you will not avail yourself of this opportunity, I must bid you good day." He turned and walked towards the door. Cairn leapt after him, but Ferrara, suddenly beginning to run, reached the end of the Egyptian room and darted out on to the landing, before his pursuer had time to realise what he was about. At the moment that Ferrara turned the corner ahead of him, Cairn saw something drop. Coming to the end of the room, he stooped and picked up this object, which was a plaited silk cord about 3 feet in length. He did not pause to examine it more closely, but thrust it into his pocket, and raced down the steps after the retreating figure of Ferrara. At the foot, a constable held out his arm, detaining him. Cairn stopped in surprise. "I must ask you for your name and address," said the constable, gruffly. "For heaven's sake, what for?" "A gentleman has complained." "My good man," exclaimed Cairn, and proffered his card. It is a practical joke on his part. I know him well." The constable looked at the card, and from the card, suspiciously back to Cairn. Apparently the appearance of the latter reassured him, or he may have formed a better opinion of Cairn from the fact that half a crown had quickly changed hands. "All right, sir," he said. "It is no affair of mine. He did not charge you with anything. He only asked me to prevent you from following him." "Quite so," snapped Cairn irritably, and dashed off along the gallery in the hope of overtaking Ferrara. But as he had feared, Ferrara had made good use of his ruse to escape. He was nowhere to be seen, and Cairn was left to wonder with what object he had risked the encounter in the Egyptian room, for that it had been deliberate and not accidental he quite clearly perceived. He walked down the steps of the museum, deep in reflection. The thought that he and his father for months had been seeking the fiend Ferrara, that they were sworn to kill him as they would kill a mad dog, and that he, Robert Cairn, had stood face to face with Ferrara, had spoken with him, and had let him go free, unscathed, was maddening. Yet, in the circumstances, how could he have acted otherwise? With no recollection of having traversed the intervening streets, he found himself walking under the archway leading to the court in which his chambers were situated. In the far corner, shadowed by the tall plane tree, where the worn iron railings of the steps and the small panes of glass in the solicitor's window on the ground floor called up memories of Charles Dickens, he paused, filled with a sort of wonderment. It seemed strange to him that such an air of peace could prevail anywhere, whilst Antony Ferrara lived and remained at large. He ran up the stairs to the second landing, opened the door, and entered his chambers. He was oppressed to day with a memory, the memory of certain gruesome happenings whereof these rooms had been the scene. Knowing the powers of Antony Ferrara, he often doubted the wisdom of living there alone, but he was persuaded that to allow these fears to make headway would be to yield a point to the enemy. Yet there were nights when he found himself sleepless, listening for sounds which had seemed to arouse him, imagining sinister whispers in his room, and imagining that he could detect the dreadful odour of the secret incense. Seating himself by the open window, he took out from his pocket the silken cord which Ferrara had dropped in the museum, and examined it curiously. His examination of the thing did not serve to enlighten him respecting its character. It was merely a piece of silken cord, very closely and curiously plaited. He threw it down on the table, determined to show it to Dr. Cairn at the earliest opportunity. He was conscious of a sort of repugnance, and, prompted by this, he carefully washed his hands as though the cord had been some unclean thing. Then he sat down to work, only to realize immediately that work was impossible until he had confided in somebody his encounter with Dr. Ferrara. Lifting the telephone receiver, he called up Dr. Cairn, but his father was not at home. He replaced the receiver, and sat staring vaguely at his open notebook. End of chapter 25. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. Chapter 26 of Brood of the Witch Queen by Sax Rohmer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 26 The Ivory Hand. For close upon an hour Robert Cairn sat at his writing table, endeavouring to puzzle out a solution to the mystery of Ferrara's motive. His reflections served only to confuse his mind. A tangible clue lay upon the table before him, the silk cord, but it was a clue of such a nature that, whatever deductions an expert detective might have based upon it, Robert Cairn could base none. Dusk was not far off, and he knew that his nerves were not what they had been before those events which had led to his Egyptian journey. He was back in his own chamber, scene of one gruesome outrage in Ferrara's unholy campaign. For darkness is the ally of crime, and it had always been in the darkness that Ferrara's activities had most fearfully manifested themselves. What was that? Cairn ran to the window, and leaning out, looked down into the court below. He could have sworn that a voice possessing a strange music, a husky music, wholly hateful, had called him by name. But at the moment the court was deserted, for it was already past the hour at which members of the legal fraternity desert their business premises to hasten homewards. Shadows were creeping under the quaint old archways, shadows were draping the ancient walls, and there was something in the aspect of the place which reminded him of a quadrangle at Oxford, across which, upon a certain fateful evening, he and another had watched the red light rising and falling in Antony Ferrara's rooms. Clearly his imagination was playing him tricks, and against this he knew full well that he must guard himself. The light in his rooms was growing dim, but instinctively his gaze sought out and found the mysterious silken cord amid the litter on the table. He contemplated the telephone, but since he had left a message for his father, he knew that the latter would ring him up directly he returned. Work, he thought, should be the likeliest antidote to the poisonous thoughts which oppressed his mind, and again he seated himself at the table and opened his notes before him. The silken rope lay close to his left hand, but he did not touch it. He was about to switch on the reading lamp, for it was now too dark to write, when his mind wandered off along another channel of reflection. He found himself picturing Myra as she had looked the last time that he had seen her. She was seated in Mr. Saunderson's garden, still pale from her dreadful illness, but beautiful, more beautiful in the eyes of Robert Cairn than any other woman in the world. The breeze was blowing her rebellious curls across her eyes bright with a happiness which he loved to see. Her cheeks were paler than they were wont to be, and the sweet lips had lost something of their firmness. She wore a short cloak and a wide-brimmed hat, unfashionable but becoming. No one but Myra could successfully have worn that hat, he thought. Wrapped in such lover-like memories, he forgot that he had sat down to write, forgot that he held a pen in his hand, and that this same hand had been outstretched to ignite the lamp. When he ultimately awoke again to the hard facts of his lonely environment, he also awoke to a singular circumstance. He made the acquaintance of a strange phenomenon. He had been writing unconsciously, and this is what he had written. Robert Cairn, renounce your pursuit of me, and renounce Myra, or to-night. The sentence was unfinished. Momentarily he stared at the words, endeavouring to persuade himself that he had written them consciously, in idle mood. But some voice within gave him the lie, so that with a suppressed groan he muttered aloud: "It has begun." Almost as he spoke there came a sound, from the passage outside, that led him to slide his hand across the table and to seize his revolver. The visible presence of the little weapon reassured him, and as a further sedative he resorted to tobacco, filled and lighted his pipe, and leant back in the chair, blowing smoke rings toward the closed door. He listened intently and heard the sound again. It was a soft hiss, and now he thought he could detect another noise, as of some creature dragging its body along the floor. A lizard, he thought, and a memory of the basilisk eyes of Antony Ferrara came to him. Both the sounds seemed to come slowly nearer and nearer, the dragging thing being evidently responsible for the hissing, until Cairn decided that the creature must be immediately outside the door. Revolver in hand, he leaped across the room and threw the door open. The red carpet to right and left was innocent of reptiles. Perhaps the creaking of the revolving chair, as he had prepared to quit it, had frightened the thing. With the idea before him, he systematically searched all the rooms into which it might have gone. His search was unavailing. The mysterious reptile was not to be found. Returning again to the study, he seated himself behind the table facing the door, which he left ajar. 10 minutes passed in silence, only broken by the dim murmur of the distant traffic. He had almost persuaded himself that his imagination, quickened by the atmosphere of mystery and horror wherein he had recently moved, was responsible for the hiss, when a new sound came to confute his reasoning. The people occupying the chambers below were moving about, so that their footsteps were faintly audible, but above these dim footsteps a rustling, vague, indefinite, demonstrated itself. As in the case of the hiss, it proceeded from the passage. A light burnt inside the outer door, and this, as Cairn knew, must cast a shadow before anything or person approaching the room. Came the rustle of light draperies. The nervous suspense was almost unbearable. He waited. What was creeping slowly, cautiously towards the open door? Cairn toyed with the trigger of his revolver. "The arts of the West shall try conclusions with those of the East," he said. A shadow. Inch upon inch it grew, creeping across the door, until it covered all the threshold visible. Someone was about to appear. He raised the revolver. The shadow moved along. Cairn saw the tail of it creep past the door until no shadow was there. The shadow had come and gone, but there was no substance. "I am going mad!" The words forced themselves to his lips. He rested his chin upon his hands and clenched his teeth grimly. Did the horrors of insanity stare him in the face? From that recent illness in London, when his nervous system had collapsed utterly, despite his stay in Egypt, he had never fully recovered. "A month will see you fit again," his father had said. But perhaps he had been wrong. Perchance the affection had been deeper than he had suspected, and now this endless carnival of supernatural happenings had strained the weakening cells, so that he was become as a man in a delirium. Where did reality end and fantasy begin? Was it all merely subjective? He had read of such aberrations, and now he sat wondering if he were the victim of a like affliction, and while he wondered he stared at the rope of silk. That was real. Logic came to his rescue. If he had seen and heard strange things, so too had Syme in Egypt, so had his father, both in Egypt and in London. Inexplicable things were happening around him, and all could not be mad. "I'm getting morbid again," he told himself. "The tricks of our damnable Ferrara are getting on my nerves. Just what he desires and intends." This latter reflection spurred him to new activity, and, pocketing the revolver, he switched off the light in the study and looked out of the window. Glancing across the court, he thought that he saw a man standing below, peering upward. With his hands resting upon the window ledge, Cairn looked long and steadily. There certainly was someone standing in the shadow of the tall plane tree, but whether man or woman he could not determine. The unknown remaining in the same position, apparently watching, Cairn ran downstairs, and passing out to the court, walked rapidly across to the tree. There he paused in some surprise. There was no one visible by the tree, and the whole court was deserted. "Must have slipped off through the archway," he concluded, and walking back, he remounted the stair and entered his chambers again. Feeling a renewed curiosity regarding the silken rope which had so strangely come into his possession, he sat down at the table, and mastering his distaste for the thing, took it in his hands and examined it closely by the light of the lamp. He was seated with his back to the windows, facing the door, so that no one could possibly have entered the room unseen by him. It was as he bent down to scrutinise the curious plating that he felt a sensation stealing over him, as though someone were standing very close to his chair. Grimly determined to resist any hypnotic tricks that might be practised against him, and well assured that there could be no person actually present in the chambers, he sat back, resting his revolver on his knee. Prompted by he knew not what, he slipped the silk cord into the table drawer and turned the key upon it. As he did so, a hand crept over his shoulder, followed by a bare arm of the hue of old ivory, a woman's arm. Transfixed he sat, his eyes fastened upon the ring of dull metal, bearing a green stone inscribed with a complex figure vaguely resembling a spider. Perfume stole to his nostrils, that of the secret incense, and the ring was the ring of the Witch Queen. In this incredible moment he relaxed that iron control of his mind which alone had saved him before. Even as he realised it and strove to recover himself, he knew that it was too late. He knew that he was lost. Gloom, blackness, unrelieved by any speck of light, murmuring subdued all around, the murmuring of a concourse of people. The darkness was odorous with a heavy perfume. A voice came, followed by complete silence. Again the voice sounded, chanting sweetly. A response followed in deep male voices. The response was taken up all around. With time, a tiny speck grew in the gloom, and grew until it took form, and out of the darkness the shape of a white-robed woman appeared, high up, far away. Wherever the ray that illumined her figure emanated from, it did not perceptibly dispel the Stygian gloom all about her. She was bathed in dazzling light, but framed in impenetrable darkness. Her dull gold hair was encircled by a band of white metal, like silver, bearing in front a round burnished disc that shone like a minor sun. Above the disc projected an ornament having the shape of a spider. The intense light picked out every detail vividly. Neck and shoulders were bare, and the gleaming ivory arms were uplifted. The long, slender fingers held aloft a golden casket covered with dim figures, almost indiscernible at that distance. A glittering zone of the same white metal confined the snowy draperies. Her bare feet peeped out from beneath the flowing robe. Above, below, and around her was Memphian darkness. Silence. The perfume was stifling. A voice, seeming to come from a great distance, cried, "On your knees to the Book of Thoth! On your knees to the Wisdom Queen, who is deathless, being unborn, who is dead though living, whose beauty is for all men, that all men may die." The whole invisible concourse took up the chant, and the light faded until only the speck on the disc below the spider was visible. Then that too vanished. A bell was ringing furiously. Its din grew louder and louder. It became insupportable. Cairn threw out his arms and staggered up like a man intoxicated. He grasped at the table lamp only just in time to prevent it overturning. The ringing was that of his telephone bell. He had been unconscious then, under some spell. He unhooked the receiver and heard his father's voice. "That you, Rob?" asked the doctor anxiously. "Yes, sir," replied Cairn eagerly, and he opened the drawer and slid his hand in for the silken cord. "There is something you have to tell me?" Cairn, without preamble, plunged excitedly into an account of his meeting with Dr. Ferrara.
"The silk cord," he concluded, "I have in my hand at the present moment, and " "Hold on a moment," came Dr. Cairn's voice, rather grimly. Followed a short interval, then: "Hullo, Bob, listen to this from to night's paper. A curious discovery was made by an attendant in one of the rooms of the Indian section of the British Museum late this evening. A case had been opened in some way, and although it contained more valuable objects, the only item which the thief had abstracted was a Thug's strangling cord from Kundali, district of Nursingpore." "But I don't understand."
"Ferrara meant you to find that cord, boy. Remember, he is unacquainted with your chambers, and he requires a focus for his damnable forces. He knows well that you will have the thing somewhere near to you, and probably he knows something of its awful history. You are in danger. Keep a fast hold upon yourself. I shall be with you in less than half an hour." End of Chapter 26. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. Chapter 27 of Brood of the Witch Queen by Sax Rohmer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 27 The Thug's Cord. As Robert Cairn hung up the receiver and found himself cut off again from the outer world, he realised, with terror beyond his control, how in this quiet backwater, so near to the main stream, he yet was far from human companionship. He recalled a night when, amid such a silence as this which now prevailed about him, he had been made the subject of an uncanny demonstration; how his sanity, his life, had been attacked; how he had fled from the crowding horrors which had been massed against him by his supernaturally endowed enemy. There was something very terrifying in the quietude of the court, a quietude which to others might have spelt peace, but which to Robert Cairn spelt menace. That Ferrara's device was aimed at his freedom, that his design was intended to lead to the detention of his enemy whilst he directed his activities in other directions, seemed plausible, if inadequate. The carefully planned incident at the Museum whereby the constable had become possessed of Cairn's card, the distinct possibility that a detective might knock upon his door at any moment, with the inevitable result of his detention pending inquiries, formed a chain which had seemed complete, save that Antony Ferrara was the schemer. For another to have compassed so much would have been a notable victory; for Ferrara such a victory would be trivial. What then did it mean? His father had told him, and the uncanny events of the evening stood evidence of Dr. Cairn's wisdom. The mysterious and evil force which Antony Ferrara controlled was being focussed upon him. Slight sounds from time to time disturbed the silence, and to these he listened attentively. He longed for the arrival of his father, for the strong, calm counsel of the one man in England fitted to cope with the hell thing which had uprisen in their midst. That he had already been subjected to some kind of hypnotic influence, he was unable to doubt; and having once been subjected to this influence, he might at any moment it was a terrible reflection fall victim to it again. Cairn directed all the energies of his mind to resistance. Ill-defined reflection must at all costs be avoided, for the brain vaguely employed he knew to be more susceptible to attack than that directed in a well-ordered channel. Clocks were chiming the hour. He did not know what hour, nor did he seek to learn. He felt that he was at rapier play with a skilled antagonist, and that to glance aside, however momentarily, was to lay himself open to a fatal thrust. He had not moved from the table, so that only the reading lamp upon it was lighted, and much of the room lay in half shadow. The silken cord, coiled snake-like, was close to his left hand; the revolver was close to his right; the muffled roar of traffic, diminished since the hour grew late, reached his ears as he sat; but nothing disturbed the stillness of the court, and nothing disturbed the stillness of the room. The notes which he had made in the afternoon at the Museum were still spread open before him. and he suddenly closed the book, fearful of anything calculated to distract him from the mood of tense resistance. His life, and more than his life, depended on his successfully opposing the insidious forces which beyond doubt invisibly surrounded the lighted table. There is a courage which is not physical, nor is it entirely moral, a courage often lacking in the most intrepid soldier. And this was the kind of courage which Robert Cairn now called up to his aid. The occult inquirer can face unmoved horrors which would turn the brain of many a man who wears the V.C. On the other hand, it is questionable if the possessor of this peculiar type of bravery could face a bayonet charge. Pluck of the physical sort Cairn had in plenty. Pluck of that more subtle kind he was acquiring from growing intimacy with the terrors of the borderland. "Who's there?" He spoke the words aloud, and the eerie sound of his own voice added a new dread to the enveloping shadows. His revolver grasped in his hand, he stood up, but slowly and cautiously, in order that his own movements might not prevent him from hearing any repetition of that which had occasioned his alarm. And what had occasioned this alarm? Either he was become again a victim of the strange trickery which already had borne him, though not physically, from Fleet Street to the sacred temple of Méydûm, or, with his material senses, he had detected a soft rapping upon the door of his room. He knew that his outer door was closed. He knew that there was no one else in his chambers, yet he had heard a sound as of knuckles beating upon the panels of the door, the closed door of the room in which he sat. Standing upright, he turned deliberately and faced in that direction. The light pouring out from beneath the shade of the table lamp scarcely touched upon the door at all. Only the ledges of the lower panels were clearly perceptible. The upper part of the door was masked in greenish yellow. Intent, tensely strung, he stood, then advanced in the direction of the switch in order to light the lamp fixed above the mantelpiece, and to illuminate the whole of the room. One step forward he took, then the soft rapping was repeated. "Who's there?" This time he cried the words loudly, and acquired some new assurance from the imperative note in his own voice. He ran to the switch and pressed it down. The lamp did not light. "The filament has burned out," he muttered. Terror grew upon him, a terror akin to that which children experience in the darkness, but he yet had a fair mastery of his emotions, when, not suddenly, as is the way of a failing electric lamp, but slowly, uncannily, unnaturally, the table lamp became extinguished. Darkness. Cairn turned towards the window. This was a moonless night, and little enough illumination entered the room from the court. 3 resounding raps were struck upon the door. At that, terror had no darker meaning for Cairn. He had plumbed its ultimate deeps. Now, like a diver, he arose again to the surface. Heedless of the darkness, of the seemingly supernatural means by which it had been occasioned, he threw open the door and thrust his revolver out into the corridor. For terrors he had been prepared, for some gruesome shape such as we read of in the Magus. There was nothing. Instinctively he had looked straight ahead of him, as one looks who expects to encounter a human enemy, but the hallway was empty. A dim light, finding access over the door from the stair, prevailed there. Yet it was sufficient to have revealed the presence of anyone or anything, had anyone or anything been present. Cairn stepped out from the room and was about to walk to the outer door. The idea of flight was strong upon him, for no man can fight the invisible, when, on a level with his eyes, flat against the wall, as though someone crouched there, he saw 2 white hands. They were slim hands, like the hands of a woman, and upon one of the tapered fingers there dully gleamed a green stone. A peal of laughter came chokingly from his lips. He knew that his reason was tottering. For these 2 white hands, which now moved along the wall, as though they were sliding to the room which Cairn had just quitted, were attached to no visible body. Just 2 ivory hands were there, and nothing more. That he was in deadly peril Cairn realized fully. His complete subjection by the will force of Ferrara had been interrupted by the ringing of the telephone bell, but now the attack had been renewed. The hands vanished. Too well he remembered the ghastly details attendant upon the death of Sir Michael Ferrara to doubt that these slim hands were directed upon murderous business. A soft swishing sound reached him. Something upon the writing table had been moved. The strangling cord. Whilst speaking to his father he had taken it out from the drawer, and when he quitted the room it had lain upon the blotting pad. He stepped back towards the outer door. Something fluttered past his face, and he turned in a mad panic. The dreadful bodiless hands groped in the darkness between himself and the exit. Vaguely it came home to him that the menace might be avoidable. He was bathed in icy perspiration. He dropped the revolver into his pocket and placed his hands upon his throat. Then he began to grope his way towards the closed door of his bedroom. Lowering his left hand, he began to feel for the door knob. As he did so, he saw, and knew, the crowning horror of the night, that he had made a false move. In retiring, he had thrown away his last, his only chance. The phantom hands, a yard apart, holding the silken cords stretched tightly between them, were approaching him swiftly. He lowered his head and charged along the passage with a wild cry. The cords, stretched taut, struck him under the chin. Back he reeled. The cord was about his throat. "God!" he choked, and thrust up his hands. Madly he strove to pluck the deadly silken thing from his neck. It was useless. A grip of steel was drawing it tightly and ever more tightly about him. Despair touched him, and almost he resigned himself. Then "Rob! Rob! Open the door!" Dr. Cairn was outside. A new strength came, and he knew that it was the last atom left to him. To remove the rope was humanly impossible. He dropped his cramped hands, bent his body by a mighty physical effort, and hurled himself forward upon the door. The latch, now, was just above his head. He stretched up and was plucked back, but the fingers of his right hand grasped the knob convulsively. Even as that superhuman force jerked him back, he turned the knob and fell. All his weight hung upon the fingers which were locked about that brass disc in a grip which even the powers of darkness could not relax. The door swung open, and Cairn swung back with it. He collapsed, an inert heap, upon the floor. Dr. Cairn leapt in over him. When he reopened his eyes, he lay in bed, and his father was bathing his inflamed throat. "All right, boy. There's no damage done, thank God."
"The hands!"
"I quite understand, but I saw no hands but your own, Rob, and if it had come to an inquest I could not even have raised my voice against a verdict of suicide."
"But I opened the door."
"They would have said that you repented your awful act too late. Although it is almost impossible for a man to strangle himself under such conditions, there is no jury in England who would have believed that Antony Ferrara had done the deed." End of chapter 27. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. Chapter 28 of Brood of the Witch Queen by Sax Rohmer. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 28 The High Priest Hortotef. The breakfast room of Dr. Cairn's house in Half Moon Street presented a cheery appearance, and this despite the gloom of the morning, for thunderous clouds hung low in the sky, and there were distant mutterings ominous of a brewing storm. Robert Cairn stood looking out of the window. He was thinking of an afternoon at Oxford, when, to such an accompaniment as this, he had witnessed the first scene in the drama of evil wherein the man called Antony Ferrara sustained the leading rôle. That the dénouement was at any moment to be anticipated, his reason told him; and some instinct that was not of his reason forewarned him too that he and his father, Dr. Cairn, were now upon the eve of that final decisive struggle which should determine the triumph of good over evil, or of evil over good. Already the doctor's house was invested by the uncanny forces marshalled by Antony Ferrara against them. The distinguished patients who daily flocked to the consulting room of the celebrated specialist, who witnessed his perfect self possession and took comfort from his confidence, knowing it for the confidence of strength, little suspected that a greater ill than any flesh is heir to, assailed the doctor to whom they came for healing. A menace, dreadful and unnatural, hung over the home, as now the thunder clouds hung over it. This well ordered household, so modern, so typical of 20th century culture and refinement, presented none of the appearances of a beleaguered garrison. Yet the house of Dr. Cairn in Half Moon Street was nothing less than an invested fortress. A peal of distant thunder boomed from the direction of Hyde Park. Robert Cairn looked up at the lowering sky as if seeking a portent. To his eyes it seemed that a livid face, malignant with the malignancy of a devil, looked down out of the clouds. Myra Duquesne came into the breakfast room. He turned to greet her, and in his capacity of accepted lover was about to kiss the tempting lips, when he hesitated and contented himself with kissing her hand. A sudden sense of the proprieties had assailed him. He reflected that the presence of the girl beneath the same roof as himself, although dictated by imperative need, might be open to misconstruction by the prudish. Dr. Cairn had decided that for the present Myra Duquesne must dwell beneath his own roof, as in feudal days. The Baron, at first hint of an approaching enemy, formerly was accustomed to call within the walls of the castle those whom it was his duty to protect. Unknown to the world, a tremendous battle raged in London. The outer works were in the possession of the enemy, and he was now before their very gates. Myra, though still pale from her recent illness, already was recovering some of the freshness of her beauty, and in her simple morning dress, as she busied herself about the breakfast table, she was a sweet picture enough, and good to look upon. Robert Cairn stood beside her, looking into her eyes, and she smiled up at him with a happy contentment, which filled him with a new longing. But "Did you dream again last night?" he asked, in a voice which he strove to make matter of fact. Myra nodded, and her face momentarily clouded over. "The same dream?" "Yes," she said in a troubled way. "At least, in some respects." Dr. Cairn came in, glancing at his watch. "Good morning," he cried cheerily. "I have actually overslept myself." They took their seats at the table. "Myra has been dreaming again, sir," said Robert Cairn slowly. The doctor, serviette in hand, glanced up with an inquiry in his grey eyes. "We must not overlook any possible weapon," he replied. "Give us particulars of your dream, Myra." As Marston entered silently with the morning fare, and, having placed the dishes upon the table, as silently withdrew, Myra began. "I seemed to stand again in the barn like building which I have described to you before. Through the rafters of the roof I could see the cracks in the tiling, and the moonlight shone through, forming light and irregular patches upon the floor. A sort of door, like that of a stable with a heavy bar across, was dimly perceptible at the farther end of the place. The only furniture was a large deal table and a wooden chair of very common kind. Upon the table stood a lamp." "What kind of lamp?" jerked Dr. Cairn. "A silver lamp." She hesitated, looking from Robert to his father. "One that I have seen in Antony's rooms. Its shaded light shone upon a closed iron box. I immediately recognised this box. You know that I described to you a dream which terrified me on the previous night?" Dr. Cairn nodded, frowning darkly. "Repeat your account of the former dream," he said. "I regard it as important." "In my former dream," the girl resumed, and her voice had an odd, far away quality, "the scene was the same, except that the light of the lamp was shining down upon the leaves of an open book, a very, very old book, written in strange characters. These characters appeared to dance before my eyes, almost as though they lived." She shuddered slightly. Then, "The same iron box, but open, stood upon the table, and a number of other smaller boxes around it. Each of these boxes was of a different material. Some were wooden, one, I think, was of ivory, one was of silver, and one of some dull metal which might have been gold. In the chair by the table
Antony was sitting. His eyes were fixed upon me with such a strange expression that I awoke, trembling frightfully."
Dr. Cairn nodded again. "And last night?" he prompted.
"Last night," continued Myra, with a note of trouble in her sweet voice, "at 4 points around the table stood 4 smaller lamps, and upon the floor were rows of characters apparently traced in luminous paint. They flickered up and then grew dim, then flickered up again in a sort of phosphorescent way. They extended from lamp to lamp, so as entirely to surround the table and chair. In the chair Antony Ferrara was sitting. He held a wand in his right hand, a wand with several copper rings about it. His left hand rested upon the iron box. In my dream, although I could see this all very clearly, I seemed to see it from a distance. Yet at the same time I stood apparently close by the tables. I cannot explain. But I could hear nothing. Only by the movements of his lips could I tell that he was speaking or chanting."
She looked across at Dr. Cairn as if fearful to proceed, but presently continued.
"Suddenly I saw a frightful shape appear on the far side of the circle. That is to say, the table was between me and this shape. It was just like a grey cloud having the vague outlines of a man, but with 2 eyes of red fire glaring out from it. Horribly, oh, horribly! It extended its shadowy arms as if saluting Antony. He turned and seemed to question it. Then with a look of ferocious anger oh, it was frightful! He dismissed the shape and began to walk up and down beside the table, but never beyond the lighted circle, shaking his fists in the air, and to judge by the movements of his lips, uttering most awful imprecations. He looked gaunt and ill. I dreamt no more, but awoke conscious of a sensation as though some dead weight, which had been pressing upon me, had been suddenly removed." Dr. Cairn glanced across at his son significantly, but the subject was not renewed throughout breakfast. Breakfast concluded. "Come into the library, Rob," said Dr. Cairn. "I have half an hour to spare, and there are some matters to be discussed." He led the way into the library with its orderly rows of obscure works, its store of forgotten wisdom, and pointed to the red leathern arm chair. As Robert Cairn seated himself and looked across at his father, who sat at the big writing table, that scene reminded him of many dangers met and overcome in the past, for the library at Half Moon Street was associated in his mind with some of the blackest pages in the history of Antony Ferrara. "Do you understand the position, Rob?" asked the doctor abruptly. "I think so, sir. This, I take it, is his last card, this outrageous, ungodly thing which he has loosed upon us." Dr. Cairn nodded grimly. "The exact frontier," he said, "dividing what we may term hypnotism from what we know as sorcery, has yet to be determined, and to which territory the doctrine of elemental spirits belongs, it would be purposeless at the moment to discuss. We may note, however, remembering with whom we are dealing, that the 108th chapter of the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead is entitled the chapter of knowing the spirits of the West. Forgetting, pro tem, that we dwell in the 20th century, and looking at the situation from the point of view, say, of Eliphas Levi, Cornelius Agrippa, or the Abbé de Villars, the man whom we know as Antony Ferrara is directing against this house and those within it a type of elemental spirit known as a salamander." Robert Cairn smiled slightly. "Ah," said the doctor with an answering smile, in which there was little mirth, "we are accustomed to laugh at this medieval terminology, but by what other can we speak of the activities of Ferrara?" "Sometimes I think we are the victims of a common madness," said his son, raising his hand to his head in a manner almost pathetic. "We are the victims of a common enemy," replied his father sternly. "He employs weapons which often enough in this enlightened age of ours have condemned poor souls, as sane as you or I, to the madhouse. Why, in God's name," he cried with a sudden excitement, "does science persistently ignore all these laws which cannot be examined in the laboratory? Will the day never come when some true man of science shall endeavour to explain the movements of a table upon which a ring of hands has been placed?
Will no exact scientist condescend to examine the properties of a planchette? Will no one do for the phenomena termed thought forms what Newton did for that of the falling apple? Ah, Rob, in some respects this is a darker age than those which bear the stigma of darkness." Silence fell for a few moments between them. Then, "One thing is certain," said Robert Cairn, deliberately. "We are in danger." "In the greatest danger." "Antony Ferrara, realizing that we are bent upon his destruction, is making a final stupendous effort to compass ours. I know that you have placed certain seals upon the windows of this house, and that after dusk these windows are never opened. I know that imprints, strangely like the imprints of fiery hands, may be seen at this moment upon the casements of Myra's room, your room, my room, and elsewhere. I know that Myra's dreams are not ordinary, meaningless dreams. I have had other evidence. I don't want to analyze these things. I confess that my mind is not capable of the task. I do not even want to know the meaning of it all. At the present moment, I only want to know one thing. Who is Antony Ferrara?" Dr. Cairn stood up and turning faced his son. "The time has come," he said, "when that question which you have asked me so many times before shall be answered. I will tell you all I know and leave you to form your own opinion. For ere we go any further, I assure you that I do not know for certain who he is." "You have said so before, sir. Will you explain what you mean?" "When his adoptive father, Sir Michael Ferrara," resumed the doctor, beginning to pace up and down the library, "when Sir Michael and I were in Egypt in the winter of 1893, we conducted certain inquiries in the Fayûm. We camped for over 3 months beside the Méydûm Pyramid. The object of our inquiries was to discover the tomb of a certain queen. I will not trouble you with the details, which could be of no interest to anyone but an Egyptologist. I will merely say that apart from the name and titles by which she is known to the ordinary student, this queen is also known to certain inquirers as the Witch Queen. She was not an Egyptian, but an Asiatic. In short, she was the last high priestess of a cult which became extinct at her death. Her secret mark I am not referring to a cartouche or anything of that kind was a spider. It was the mark of the religion or cult which she practised. The high priest of the principal temple of Ra, during the reign of the Pharaoh who was this queen's husband, was one Hortotef. This was his official position, but secretly he was also the high priest of the sinister creed to which I have referred. The temple of this religion, a religion allied to black magic, was the Pyramid of Méydûm. So much we knew, or Ferrara knew, and imparted to me, but for any corroborative evidence of this cult's existence we searched in vain. We explored the interior of the pyramid, foot by foot, inch by inch, and found nothing. We knew that there was some other apartment in the pyramid, but in spite of our soundings, measurements, and laborious excavations, we did not come upon the entrance to it. The tomb of the queen we failed to discover, also, and therefore concluded that her mummy was buried in the secret chamber of the pyramid. We had abandoned our quest in despair, when, excavating in one of the neighbouring mounds, we made a discovery." He opened a box of cigars, selected one, and pushed the box towards his son. Robert shook his head, almost impatiently, but Dr. Cairn lighted the cigar ere resuming. "Directed, as I now believe, by a malignant will, we blundered upon the tomb of the high priest." "You found his mummy?" "We found his mummy, yes. But owing to the carelessness and the fear of the native labourers, it was exposed to the sun and crumpled, was lost. I would a similar fate had attended the other one which we found." "What? Another mummy?" "We discovered," Dr. Cairn spoke very deliberately, "a certain papyrus. The translation of this is contained," he rested the point of his finger upon the writing table, "in the unpublished book of Sir Michael Ferrara, which lies here. That book, Rob, will never be published now. Furthermore, we discovered the mummy of a child." "A child?" "A boy. Not daring to trust the natives, we removed it secretly at night to our own tent. Before we commenced the task of unwrapping it, Sir Michael, the most brilliant scholar of his age, had proceeded so far in deciphering the papyrus that he determined to complete his reading before we proceeded further. It contained directions for performing a certain process. This process had reference to the mummy of the child."
"Do I understand?"
"Already you are discrediting the story. Ah, I can see it. But let me finish. Unaided we performed this process upon the embalmed body of the child. Then, in accordance with the directions of that dead magician, that accursed malignant being, who thus had sought to secure for himself a new tenure of evil life, we laid the mummy, treated in a certain fashion, in the king's chamber of the Méydûm pyramid. It remained there for 30 days, from moon to moon."
"You guarded the entrance?"
"You may assume what you like, Rob, but I could swear before any jury that no one entered that pyramid through that time. Yet since we were only human, we may have been deceived in this. I have only to add, that when at the rising of the new moon in the ancient Sothic month of Panoi, we again entered the chamber, a living baby, some 6 months old, perfectly healthy, solemnly blinked up at the lights which we held in our trembling hands." Dr. Cairn reseated himself at the table, and turned the chair so that he faced his son. With the smouldering cigar between his teeth he sat, a slight smile upon his lips. Now it was Robert's turn to rise and begin feverishly to pace the floor.
"You mean, sir, that this infant which lay in the pyramid was adopted by Sir Michael?"
"Was adopted, yes. Sir Michael engaged nurses for him, reared him here in England, educating him as an Englishman, sent him to a public school, sent him to—"
"To Oxford! Antony Ferrara! What! Do you seriously tell me that this is the history of Antony Ferrara?"
"On my word of honour, boy, that is all I know of Antony Ferrara. Is it not enough?"
"Merciful God, it is incredible!" groaned Robert Cairn.
"From the time that he attained to manhood," said Dr. Cairn evenly, "this adopted son of my poor old friend has passed from crime to crime. By means which are beyond my comprehension, and which alone serve to confirm his supernatural origin, he has acquired knowledge. According to the ancient Egyptian beliefs, the Khu, or magical powers, of a fully equipped adept, at the death of the body, could enter into anything prepared for its reception. According to these ancient beliefs, then, the Khu of the high priest Hortotef entered into the body of this infant, who was his son, and whose mother was the Witch Queen, and to day, in this modern London, a wizard of ancient Egypt, armed with the lost lore of that magical land, walks amongst us. What that lore is worth, it will be profitless for us to discuss, but that he possesses it, all of it, I know beyond doubt. The most ancient and most powerful magic book which has ever existed was the Book of Thoth." He walked across to a distant shelf, selected a volume, opened it at a particular page, and placed it on his son's knees. "Read here," he said, pointing. The words seemed to dance before the younger man's eyes, and this is what he read:
"To read 2 pages enables you to enchant the heavens, the earth, the abyss, the mountains, and the sea. You shall know what the birds of the sky and the crawling things are saying. And when the 2nd page is read, if you are in the world of ghosts, you will grow again in the shape you were on earth." "Heavens!" whispered Robert Cairn. "Is this the writing of a madman, or can such things possibly be?" He read on: "This book is in the middle of the river at Koptos, in an iron box." "An iron box," he muttered. "An iron box."
"So you recognize the iron box?" jerked Dr. Cairn. His son read on:
"In the iron box is a bronze box. In the bronze box is a sycamore box. In the sycamore box is an ivory and ebony box. In the ivory and ebony box is a silver box. In the silver box is a golden box. And in that is the book. It is twisted all round with snakes and scorpions and all other crawling things."
"The man who holds the Book of Thoth," said Dr. Cairn, breaking the silence, "holds a power that should only belong to God. The creature who is known to the world as Antony Ferrara holds that book. Do you doubt it? Therefore you know now, as I have known long enough, with what manner of enemy we are fighting. You know that this time it is a fight to the death." He stopped abruptly, staring out of the window. A man with a large photographic camera, standing upon the opposite pavement, was busily engaged in focusing the house.
"What is this?" muttered Robert Cairn, also stepping to the window.
"It is a link between sorcery and science," replied the doctor. "You remember Ferrara's photographic gallery at Oxford, the Zenana you used to call it? You remember having seen in his collection photographs of persons who afterwards came to violent ends?"
"I begin to understand."
"Thus far his endeavours to concentrate the whole of the evil forces at his command upon this house have had but poor results, having merely caused Myra to dream strange dreams, clairvoyant dreams, instructive dreams, more useful to us than to the enemy, and having resulted in certain marks upon the outside of the house adjoining the windows which I have sealed in a particular manner. You understand?"
"By means of photographs he concentrates in some way malignant forces upon certain points."
"He focuses his will, yes. The man who can really control his will, Rob, is supreme, below the Godhead. Ferrara can almost do this now. Before he has become wholly proficient "
"I understand, sir," snapped his son grimly.
"He is barely of age, boy," Dr. Cairn said, almost in a whisper. "In another year he would menace the world. Where are you going?" He grasped his son's arm as Robert started for the door.
"That man yonder."
"Diplomacy, Rob. Guile against guile. Let the man do his work, which he does in all innocence. Then follow him. Learn where his studio is situated, and from that point proceed to learn."
"The situation of Ferrara's hiding place?" cried his son excitedly. "I understand. Of course. You are right, sir."
"I will leave the inquiry in your hands, Rob. Unfortunately, other duties call me."
Chapter 28. Rancho San Diego, California. Chapter 29 of Brood of the Witch Queen by Sax Rohmer. Is in the public domain. Chapter 29 The Wizard's Den. Robert Cairn entered a photographer's shop in Baker Street. "You recently arranged to do views of some houses in the West End for a gentleman?" he said to the girl in charge.
"That is so," she replied, after a moment's hesitation. "We did pictures of the house of some celebrated specialist for a magazine article they were intended. Do you wish us to do something similar?"
"Not at the moment," replied Robert Cairn, smiling slightly. "I merely want the address of your client."
"I don't know that I can give you that," replied the girl doubtfully, "but he will be here about 11 o'clock for proofs, if you wish to see him."
"I wonder if I can confide in you," said Robert Cairn, looking the girl frankly in the eyes. She seemed rather confused.
"I hope there is nothing wrong," she murmured.
"You have nothing to fear," he replied, "but unfortunately there is something wrong, which, however, I cannot explain. Will you promise me not to tell your client I do not ask his name that I have been here, or have been making any inquiries respecting him?"
"I think I can promise that," she replied.
"I am much indebted to you." Robert Cairn hastily left the shop and began to look about him for a likely hiding place from whence, unobserved, he might watch the photographers. An antique furniture dealer's, some little distance along the opposite side, attracted his attention. He glanced at his watch. It was 10:30. If, upon the pretence of examining some of the stock, he could linger in the furniture shop for half an hour, he would be enabled to get upon the track of Ferrara. His mind made up, he walked along and entered the shop. For the next half an hour he passed from item to item of the collection displayed there, surveying each in the leisurely manner of a connoisseur. But always he kept a watch, through the window, upon the photographer's establishment beyond. Promptly at 11 o'clock a taxicab drew up at the door, and from it a slim man alighted. He wore, despite the heat of the morning, an overcoat of some woolly material, and in his gait, as he crossed the pavement to enter the shop,
There was something revoltingly effeminate, a sort of cat like grace which had been noticeable in a woman, but which in a man was unnatural and, for some obscure reason, sinister. It was Antony Ferrara. Even at that distance and in that brief time, Robert Cairn could see the ivory face, the abnormal red lips, and the long black eyes of this arch fiend, this monster masquerading as a man. He had much ado to restrain his rising passion, but, knowing that all depended upon his cool action, he waited until Ferrara had entered the photographer's. With a word of apology to the furniture dealer, he passed quickly into Baker Street. Everything rested now upon his securing a cab before Ferrara came out again. Ferrara's cabman evidently was waiting for him. A taxi driver fortunately hailed Cairn at the very moment that he gained the pavement, and Cairn, concealing himself behind the vehicle, gave the man rapid instructions. "You see that taxi outside the photographer's?" he said. The man nodded. "Wait until someone comes out of the shop and is driven off in it. Then follow. Do not lose sight of the cab for a moment. When it draws up, and wherever it draws up, drive right past it. Don't attract attention by stopping. You understand?" "Quite, sir," said the man, smiling slightly, and Cairn entered the cab. The cabman drew up at a point some little distance beyond, from whence he could watch. 2 minutes later Ferrara came out and was driven off. The pursuit commenced. His cab, ahead, proceeded to Westminster Bridge, across to the south side of the river, and by way of that commercial thoroughfare at the back of St. Thomas' Hospital, emerged at Vauxhall. Thence the pursuit led to Stockwell, Herne Hill, and yet onward towards Dulwich. It suddenly occurred to Robert Cairn that Ferrara was making in the direction of Mr. Saunderson's house at Dulwich Common, the house in which Myra had had her mysterious illness, in which she had remained until it had become evident that her safety depended upon her never being left alone for one moment. "What can be his object?" muttered Cairn. He wondered if Ferrara, for some inscrutable reason, was about to call upon Mr. Saunderson. But when the cab ahead, having passed the park, continued on past the lane in which the house was situated, he began to search for some other solution to the problem of Ferrara's destination. Suddenly he saw that the cab ahead had stopped. The driver of his own cab, without slackening speed, pursued his way. Cairn crouched down upon the floor, fearful of being observed. No house was visible to right nor left, merely open fields, and he knew that it would be impossible for him to delay in such a spot without attracting attention. Ferrara's cab passed. "Keep on till I tell you to stop," cried Cairn. He dropped the speaking tube and, turning, looked out through the little window at the back. Ferrara had dismissed his cab. He saw him entering a gate and crossing a field on the right of the road. Cairn turned again and took up the tube. "Stop at the first house we come to," he directed. "Hurry." Presently a deserted looking building was reached, a large straggling house which obviously had no tenant. Here the man pulled up and Cairn leaped out. As he did so, he heard Ferrara's cab driving back by the way it had come. "Here," he said, and gave the man half a sovereign. "Wait for me." He started back along the road at a run. Even had he suspected that he was followed, Ferrara could not have seen him. But when Cairn came up level with the gate through which Ferrara had gone, he slowed down and crept cautiously forward. Ferrara, who by this time had reached the other side of the field, was in the act of entering a barn-like building which evidently at some time had formed a portion of a farm. As the distant figure opening one of the big doors disappeared within, "The place of which Myra has been dreaming," muttered Cairn. Certainly, viewed from that point, it seemed to answer externally to the girl's description. The roof was of moss grown red tiles, and Cairn could imagine how the moonlight would readily find access through the chinks which beyond doubt existed in the weather worn structure. He had little doubt that this was the place dreamt of, or seen clairvoyantly, by Myra; that this was the place to which Ferrara had retreated in order to conduct his nefarious operations. It was eminently suited to the purpose, being entirely surrounded by unoccupied land. For what ostensible purpose Ferrara has leased it he could not conjecture, nor could he concern himself with the matter. The purpose for which actually he had leased the place was sufficiently evident to the man who had suffered so much at the hands of this modern sorcerer. To approach closer would have been indiscreet. This he knew, and he was sufficiently diplomatic to resist the temptation to obtain a nearer view of the place. He knew that everything depended upon secrecy. Antony Ferrara must not suspect that his black laboratory was known. Cairn decided to return to Half Moon Street without delay, fully satisfied with the result of his investigation. He walked rapidly back to where the cab waited, gave the man his father's address, and in 3/4 of an hour was back in Half Moon Street. Dr. Cairn had not yet dismissed the last of his patients. Myra, accompanied by Miss Saunderson, was out shopping, and Robert found himself compelled to possess his soul in patience. He paced restlessly up and down the library, sometimes taking a book at random, scanning its pages with unseeing eyes, and replacing it without having formed the slightest impression of its contents. He tried to smoke, but his pipe was constantly going out, and he had littered the hearth untidily with burnt matches, when Dr. Cairn suddenly opened the library door and entered. "Well?" he said eagerly. Robert Cairn leaped forward. "I have tracked him, sir," he cried. "My God! While Myra was at Saunderson's, she was almost next door to the beast. His den is in a field no more than 1,000 yards from the garden wall, from Saunderson's orchid houses." "He is daring," muttered Dr. Cairn, "but his selection of that site served two purposes. The spot was suitable in many ways, and we were least likely to look for him next door, as it were. It was a move characteristic of the accomplished criminal." Robert Cairn nodded. "It is the place of which Myra dreamt, sir. I have not the slightest doubt about that. What we have to find out is what times of the day and night he goes there." "I doubt," interrupted Dr. Cairn, "if he often visits the place during the day. But I have no doubt, knowing his sybaritic habits, that he has some other palatial place in town. I have been making inquiries in several directions, especially in certain directions." He paused, raising his eyebrows significantly. "Additions to the Zenana?" inquired Robert. Dr. Cairn nodded his head grimly. "Exactly," he replied. "There is not a scrap of evidence upon which legally he could be convicted, but since his return from Egypt, Rob, he has added other victims to the list." "The fiend!" cried the younger man. "The unnatural fiend!" "Unnatural is the word. He is literally unnatural. But many women find him irresistible. He is typical of the unholy brood to which he belongs. The evil beauty of the Witch Queen sent many a soul to perdition. The evil beauty of her son has zealously carried on the work." "What must we do?" "I doubt if we can do anything to day. Obviously, the early morning is the most suitable time to visit his den at Dulwich Common." "But the new photographs of the house. There will be another attempt upon us to night." "Yes, there will be another attempt upon us to night," said the doctor wearily. "This is the year 1914, yet here in Half Moon Street, when dusk falls, we shall be submitted to an attack of a kind to which mankind probably has not been submitted for many ages. We shall be called upon to dabble in the despised magical art. We shall be called upon to place certain seals upon our doors and windows, to protect ourselves against an enemy who, like Eros, laughs at locks and bars." "Is it possible for him to succeed?" "Quite possible, Rob, in spite of all our precautions. I feel in my very bones that to night he will put forth a supreme effort." A bell rang. "I think," continued the doctor, "that this is Myra. She must get all the sleep she can during the afternoon, for to night I have determined that she, and you, and I must not think of sleep, but must remain together here in the library. We must not lose sight of one another. You understand?" "I am glad you have proposed it," cried Robert Cairn eagerly. "I, too, feel that we have come to a critical moment in the contest." "To night," continued the doctor, "I shall be prepared to take certain steps. My preparations will occupy me throughout the rest of to day." Chapter 29. By Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. Chapter 30 of Brood of the Witch Queen by Sax Rohmer. Recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 30 The Elemental. At dusk that evening Dr. Cairn, his son, and Myra Duquesne met together in the library. The girl looked rather pale. An odour of incense pervaded the house, coming from the doctor's study, wherein he had locked himself early in the evening, issuing instructions that he was not to be disturbed. The exact nature of the preparations which he had been making, Robert Cairn was unable to conjecture, and some instinct warned him that his father would not welcome any inquiry upon the matter. He realised that Dr. Cairn proposed to fight Antony Ferrara with his own weapons. And now, when something in the very air of the house seemed to warn them of a tremendous attack impending, that the doctor, much against his will, was entering the arena in the character of a practical magician, a character new to him and obviously abhorrent. At 10:30 the servants all retired in accordance with Dr. Cairn's orders. From where he stood by the tall mantelpiece, Robert Cairn could catch Myra Duquesne, a dainty picture in her simple evening gown, where she sat reading in a distant corner, her delicate beauty forming a strong contrast to the background of sombre volumes. Dr. Cairn sat by the big table smoking and apparently listening. A strange device which he had adopted every evening for the past week he had adopted again to night. There were little white seals, bearing a curious figure, consisting in interlaced triangles, upon the insides of every window in the house, upon the doors, and even upon the fire grates. Robert Cairn at another time might have thought his father mad, childish, thus to play at wizardry, but he had had experiences which had taught him to recognise that upon such seemingly trivial matters great issues might turn. That in the strange land over the border there were stranger laws, laws which he could but dimly understand. There he acknowledged the superior wisdom of Dr. Cairn, and did not question it. At 11 o'clock a comparative quiet had come upon Half Moon Street. The sound of the traffic had gradually subsided, until it seemed to him that the house stood, not in the busy West End of London, but isolated apart from its neighbours. It seemed to him an abode marked out and separated from the other abodes of man, a house enveloped in an impalpable cloud, a cloud of evil, summoned up and directed by the wizard hand of Antony Ferrara, son of the Witch Queen. Although Myra pretended to read, and Dr. Cairn, from his fixed expression, might have been supposed to be preoccupied, in point of fact they were all waiting, with nerves at highest tension, for the opening of the attack. In what form it would come, whether it would be vague moanings and tappings upon the windows, such as they had already experienced, whether it would be a phantasmal storm, a clap of phenomenal thunder, they could not conjecture. If the enemy would attack suddenly, or if his menace would grow, threatening from afar off, and then gradually penetrating into the heart of the garrison. It came, then, suddenly and dramatically. Dropping her book, Myra uttered a piercing scream, and with eyes glaring madly, fell forward on the carpet, unconscious. Robert Cairn leapt to his feet with clenched fists. His father stood up so rapidly as to overset his chair, which fell crashingly upon the floor. Together they turned and looked in the direction in which the girl had been looking. They fixed their eyes upon the drapery of the library window, which was drawn together. The whole window was luminous as though a bright light shone outside, but luminous as though that light were the light of some unholy fire. Involuntarily they both stepped back, and Robert Cairn clutched his father's arm convulsively. The curtains seemed to be rendered transparent, as if some powerful ray were directed upon them. The window appeared through them as a rectangular blue patch. Only 2 lamps were burning in the library, that in the corner by which Myra had been reading, and the green shaded lamp upon the table. The best end of the room by the window, then, was in shadow, against which this unnatural light shone brilliantly. "My God!" whispered Robert Cairn. "That's Half Moon Street outside. There can be no light." He broke off, for now he perceived the thing which had occasioned the girl's scream of horror. In the middle of the rectangular patch of light a grey shape, but partially opaque, moved, shifting luminous clouds about it. It was taking form, growing momentarily more substantial. It had some remote semblance of a man, but its unique characteristic was its awful greyness. It had the greyness of a rain cloud, yet rather that of a column of smoke. And from the centre of the dimly defined head, two eyes, balls of living fire, glared out into the room. Heat was beating into the library from the window, physical heat, as though a furnace door had been opened. And the shape, ever growing more palpable, was moving forward towards them, approaching, the heat every instant growing greater. It was impossible to look at those two eyes of fire. It was almost impossible to move. Indeed, Robert Cairn was transfixed in such horror as, in all his dealings with the monstrous Ferrara, he had never known before. But his father, shaking off the dread which possessed him also, leapt at one bound to the library table. Robert Cairn vaguely perceived that a small group of objects, looking like balls of wax, lay there. Dr. Cairn had evidently been preparing them in the locked study. Now he took them all up in his left hand and confronted the thing, which seemed to be growing into the room, for it did not advance in the ordinary sense of the word. One by one he threw the white pellets into that vapoury greyness. As they touched the curtain they hissed as if they had been thrown into a fire. They melted, and upon the transparency of the drapings, as upon a sheet of gauze, showed faint streaks, where melting they trickled down the tapestry. As he cast each pellet from his hand, Dr. Cairn took a step forward and cried out certain words in a loud voice, words which Robert Cairn knew he had never heard uttered before, words in a language which some instinct told him to be ancient Egyptian. Their effect was to force that dreadful shape gradually to disperse, as a cloud of smoke might disperse when the fire which occasions it is extinguished slowly. 7 pellets in all he threw towards the window, and the 7th struck the curtains, now once more visible in their proper form. The fire elemental had been vanquished. Robert Cairn clutched his hair in a sort of frenzy. He glared at the draped window, feeling that he was making a supreme effort to retain his sanity. Had it ever looked otherwise? Had the tapestry ever faded before him, becoming visible in a great light which had shone through it from behind? Had the thing, a thing unnameable, indescribable, stood there? He read his answer upon the tapestry. Whitening streaks showed where the pellets, melting, had trickled down the curtain. "Left Myra on the settee." It was Dr. Cairn speaking, calmly, but in a strained voice. Robert Cairn, as if emerging from a mist, turned to the recumbent white form upon the carpet. Then, with a great cry, he leaped forward and raised Myra's head. "Myra!" he groaned. "Myra, speak to me!" "Control yourself, boy!" rapped Dr. Cairn sternly. "She cannot speak until you have revived her. She has swooned, nothing worse." "And we have conquered." End of chapter 30, read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. Chapter 31 of Brood of the Witch Queen by Sax Rohmer. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 31 The Book of Thoth. The mists of early morning still floated over the fields, when these two, set upon strange business, walked through the damp grass to the door of the barn, wherefrom radiated the deathly waves which on the previous night had reached them, or almost reached them, in the library at Half Moon Street. The big double doors were padlocked, but for this they had come provided. 10 minutes' work upon the padlocks sufficed, and Dr. Cairn swung wide the doors. A suffocating smell, the smell of that incense with which they had too often come in contact, was wafted out to them. There was a dim light inside the place, and without hesitation both entered. A deal table and chair constituted the sole furniture of the interior. A part of the floor was roughly boarded, and a brief examination of the boarding sufficed to discover the hiding place in which Antony Ferrara kept the utensils of his awful art. Dr. Cairn lifted out 2 heavy boards, and in a recess below lay a number of singular objects, There were 4 antique lamps of most peculiar design. There was a larger silver lamp which both of them had seen before in various apartments occupied by Antony Ferrara. There were a number of other things which Robert Cairn could not have described, had he been called upon to do so, for the reason that he had seen nothing like them before and had no idea of their nature or purpose. But, conspicuous amongst this curious hoard, was a square iron box of workmanship dissimilar from any workmanship known to Robert Cairn. Its lid was covered with a sort of scroll work, and he was about to reach down in order to lift it out, when "Do not touch it!" cried the doctor. "For God's sake, do not touch it!" Robert Cairn started back as though he had seen a snake. Turning to his father, he saw that the latter was pulling on a pair of white gloves. As he fixed his eyes upon these in astonishment, he perceived that they were smeared all over with some white preparation. "Stand aside, boy," said the doctor, and for once his voice shook slightly. "Do not look again until I call to you. Turn your head aside." Silent with amazement, Robert Cairn obeyed. He heard his father lift out the iron box. He heard him open it, for he had already perceived that it was not locked. Then, quite distinctly, he heard him close it again and replace it in the cache. "Do not turn, boy," came a hoarse whisper. He did not turn, but waited, his heart beating painfully for what should happen next. "Stand aside from the door," came the order, "and when I have gone out, do not look after me. I will call to you when it is finished." He obeyed without demur. His father passed him, and he heard him walking through the damp grass outside the door of the barn. There followed an intolerable interval. From some place, not very distant, he could hear Dr. Cairn moving, hear the chink of glass upon glass, as though he were pouring out something from a stoppered bottle. Then a faint acrid smell was wafted to his nostrils, perceptible even above the heavy odour of the incense from the barn. "Relock the door!" came the cry. Robert Cairn reclosed the door, snapped the padlock fast, and began to fumble with the skeleton keys with which they had come provided. He discovered that to reclose the padlock was quite as difficult as to open it. His hands were trembling, too. He was all anxiety to see what had taken place behind him, so that when at last a sharp click told of the task accomplished, he turned in a flash and saw his father placing tufts of grass upon a charred patch from which a faint haze of smoke still arose. He walked over and joined him. "What have you done, sir?" "I have robbed him of his armour," replied the doctor grimly. His face was very pale, his eyes were very bright. "I have destroyed the Book of Thoth." "Then he will be unable—" "He will still be able to summon his dreadful servant, Rob. Having summoned him once, he can summon him again, but—" "Well, sir?" "He cannot control him." "Good God!" That night brought no repetition of the uncanny attack, and in the grey half light before the dawn, Dr. Cairn and his son, themselves like two phantoms, again crept across the field to the barn. The padlock hung loose in the ring. "Stay where you are, Rob," cautioned the doctor. He gently pushed the door open, wider, and looked in. There was an overpowering odour of burning flesh. He turned to Robert and spoke in a steady voice. "The brood of the Witch Queen is extinct," he said. End of Chapter 31. End of Brood of the Witch Queen, by Sax Rohmer. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California.